I'm a 31-year-old guy, and I live in a small town in Canada, but this took place almost 10 years ago. I'm a short drive away from Thunder Bay, Ontario, and when this happened, I was on a road trip alone to visit my brother, who lived about an 8-hour drive away. If you don't know the highways around there, there's a lot of forest and the occasional town where you can stop to eat or go to the bathroom. The roads are long, and there's not a lot going on. To make matters worse, there are a lot of drunk drivers if you stay out late. Because of that, I would always try not to drive after dark. Overall, it's a pretty boring drive, and I try to only do it a few times per year. I usually try to do it in one day, but this time, it was raining, and the roads were too dangerous to drive at full speed. I estimated the drive would take around 11 hours instead of the usual 8. Because of that, I figured I'd have to stop at some point and spend the night, especially if I wanted to avoid driving after dark. Although I had done the drive before, I didn't know the way well enough to choose a good place to stop. The information online was not very good either, so I didn't really know where I would stay. I had been on the road for around 6 hours, and it was getting dark. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the noise on my car was deafening. I could barely listen to music, it was so loud. I was keeping an eye out for a place to stop. A roadside motel would be best. There hadn't been much in the last hour though, but I was seeing signs that indicated a town was coming up. Even though I'm from the area, every time I drive that way, there are towns I swear I've never heard of. This was one of them. When the time came, I turned off the highway and made my way into this small town. It was only 7 p.m., but on my first pass of this place, it was eerily quiet. There was a post office, a grocery store, and an LCBO. That's the liquor store in Ontario. I also saw a gas station that looked closed. I wasn't sure if it was out of business or if it was just closed for the night. I don't know of any gas stations that close at 7 p.m., so I suppose it was the former. One thing that I didn't see was a motel, or a hotel of any kind. I was really looking forward to a shower and a bed, but it was starting to look like that wouldn't happen. After I drove the empty streets another time, I was certain I would be sleeping in my car for the night. I did see a small diner that was open. Besides that, there were just some houses and a small apartment building. I went to the restaurant and ordered dinner. Then I nursed a beer until they kicked me out. By then, it was just past 10 o'clock. I made my way back to the closed gas station, because I thought that would be the best place for me to park for the night. By then, the rain had slowed down considerably, and I started seeing some people out on the streets. One of them was a single man walking down the sidewalk. He was wearing dark, baggy clothes, and seemed to walk with a limp. He had long dark hair, and he was quite tall. I drove past him, and felt his glare as I did, but it was too dark to tell for sure if it was my imagination. When I got to the parking lot of the gas station, I parked in the far corner and reclined my seat. Although it was early in the evening, I was tired. After another 10 to 15 minutes, the rain picked up again. Large drops pelted my windshield, making quite a loud noise with each one. I actually found it quite soothing, so it didn't bother me. I laid back in my seat and tried to get some sleep. Not surprisingly, I didn't get to sleep right away. Though the rain was heavy, I noticed the faint sound of footsteps outside my car. I opened my eyes and saw what looked like a man walking past my car. I was surprised that anyone would be out there in the rain, but since I was technically trespassing, my first thought that it was the police, or maybe the owner of the gas station. I was ready to move along if needed, so I sat up and turned on my light. Just then, I heard a loud crash coming from the back of my car. I turned around, but all that I could see was that my back window was shattered. Then I heard the sound again. Someone was out there hacking away at my car. Since it was dark outside, I couldn't see who it was or how many of them there were. Whoever it was, they kept slamming my back window. I didn't know how long the shattered window would hold, so I fired up my engine and flicked on my headlights. Off in the distance, I saw a police car parked across the lot. His lights were off, and the driver's side window was open. A single officer sat there in the front seat, smoking a cigarette. He was watching my car with a bored look on his face. He was just sitting there watching as someone tried to smash into my car, and he didn't do a thing. My foot moved to the gas pedal, and I drove out of there. I tried looking in my rearview mirror to see my attacker, but the glass was way too messed up to see through. I thought at that point that there'd be no sense in trying to sleep, so I decided to take my chances on the road and drive through the night. That way, I would get to my brother's early in the morning, and maybe I could take a nap. Obviously, I didn't bother calling the cops, because there was one right there, and he did nothing. The rain splashed beneath my tires as I sped away. Luckily, my back window was still intact, although it was badly shattered. After another half hour on the road, I saw flashing lights behind me. I was being pulled over. My car eased to the shoulder, and I brought it to a stop. I rolled down my window, and an officer approached. It was the same cop who watched me getting attacked earlier.
"Evening, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over?"
He asked. "No, why?" I said, pretending I didn't recognize him.
"It's no big deal. One of your taillights is out. Just get it checked in the morning."
There was a strange tension between us as I sat there trying to understand what his angle was. He didn't say a word about my totally smashed back window. To this day, it was the creepiest and most awkward 2 minutes of my life. After that, the cop started to walk away. Against my better judgment, I called out to him. "Excuse me, sir. What's your badge number?" The officer walked back over to my window, put his hand on the roof of my car, and said,
"Don't push your luck."
Then he walked back to his car and drove back in the opposite direction. It was early morning by the time I got to my brother's town. When I pulled into his driveway, I finally had a chance to assess the damage to my car. Other than the back window, both of my taillights were smashed, and my license plate was missing. The cop didn't even bother to mention that. After days of thinking, I'm pretty sure it was a random act of violence. As for the cop, I'm pretty sure he was a real police officer. However, I filed a report with the OPP, but never found out who he was. To this day, I still can't explain why he followed me, only to give me a warning. I think he just wanted to rub it in on me. It was like some kind of a power move. All I know now is that whenever I'm on the road, I make sure to skip that town. I work as a contractor in a small town. Most of my work is renovating older houses, but I do all kinds of things including some basic landscaping and carpentry. Since it's a smaller community, I have to be kind of a jack of all trades, although I think I'm a master of a few as well. This story is about a client of mine who turned out to be a total psycho. My marketing budget was really low. I just had a basic website and a business page on Facebook. That was it. One morning, I was checking my messages before heading out to a job site. I got a new message from a guy named John, who lived in the next town over from me. His profile was minimal, just his name and the town where he lived. He said that he had some work to be done on his house, but he didn't give much detail up front. I replied and told him I could stop by after work that day. I finished work early and headed over to John's place. It was in one of the nicer neighborhoods I had seen in the area. John's house was a beautiful gray brick place with a wraparound porch and a long driveway. I drove my white pickup truck up to the front door and got out. I felt underdressed in my ragged work clothes. One knock on the door was all it took. A man swung the door open and stood in the doorway. He was about 50 years old, with a gray ponytail and glasses. The man introduced himself as John and gave me a little more detail on the work while leading me to the basement. He told me he wanted a reinforced room to use as an office. He wanted soundproofing and a security door. John told me that he had some important documents and equipment that was worth extra protection. The soundproofing was so that he could work in peace and quiet at all times. I thought that made sense. I got the impression that John was rich, so there's no telling what kind of important stuff he had. I had never done a project like that, but it seemed like it was within my skill set. When we got to the bottom of the stairs, John led me to a small room at the end of a long hallway. I would have thought it was meant to be a laundry room, or maybe storage. The room was narrow, and there were no windows. It seemed like a bad place for an office. I didn't know why anyone would want to spend any amount of time in that room, especially with such a beautiful house. There were many better places. I figured security was his main concern though, but it still seemed off. Once we were there, John stood in the doorway while I took some measurements. Since the room was small, it would be pretty easy for me to fit it into my schedule. It was probably a single-day project. I gave him a quick quote right there, and he readily accepted. I almost wished I'd asked for more. I went home that night and didn't think much of it. The next week, I had a day to spend on the project. I headed over to John's place and knocked on the front door. He answered the door and let me in. When I was in the basement working, John was upstairs in the house. After I installed the soundproofing and added a layer of plywood over it, the room took on an eerie vibe. It was looking more and more like a prison cell than an office. The layers of foam and wood made the room look even smaller. I was feeling claustrophobic being in there. It was then that I started to become really suspicious. I finished most of the work by 1 p.m., at which time John invited me upstairs for lunch. That was not usual in my experience, but much appreciated. I headed up and joined John at the kitchen table. Sitting across from him was uncomfortable. Something about this guy began to put me off. Up until then, our interactions had been purely business. Now I was having lunch with the guy, and I was seeing his personality. He was very cold, with a blank look in his eyes. I told John that I was almost done, and all I had to do was install the large steel door. After lunch, I went back down to the basement and finished up the work. By the time I was done, it was only 3:30 p.m. I was ready to call it a day, and I saw John approaching from the hallway, and he had something in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was, because it was in a white plastic bag. He walked up to me and looked everything over.
Good job,
John said, seeming pleased.
There's one more thing I'd like you to do,
he added. Then he opened the bag and took out a new lock. It was a deadbolt lock. That made sense because there wasn't a deadbolt on the door. I took a closer look and noticed that it was a one-way lock, meaning you could only lock it from the outside. By then, I was getting really suspicious. I thought this guy was building a prison cell or some kind of dungeon in his house. There was no smoking gun, and I certainly couldn't prove it, but that was what I thought. Not wanting to do any more work for the guy, I made up an excuse not to install the lock. I told him that it didn't fit the door, or some BS like that. He seemed to buy it, so he paid me, and I left. When I got home, I googled John's name. I had his last name too. To my shock, I found a pretty concerning criminal record on him. Records like that are public where I live, so I was able to find out that he was convicted of several serious crimes, the most startling of which being kidnapping. With that knowledge, what I saw before seemed even more concerning. That was when I decided to report him to the police. I drove there that night and told the cops everything I knew. Obviously, it's not illegal to soundproof a room, but I thought it was worth it to watch the guy. They seemed to take it seriously because they knew who John was. They promised to look into it and keep an eye on him. I watched the news every once in a while to see if anything came up, but nothing has. As far as I know, John is still out there with a freaking prison cell in his basement. I pray that I was mistaken, but I think that guy was up to something bad. I had a property near a small town, but out in the country. There was a lot of space out there, and it was only one town over from where I grew up. I still had some friends and family there, so I was happy to make the move. Before then, I had a small apartment in the city, but my work let me go fully remote, so I didn't need to be there anymore at all. It was a small community that was still only an hour drive out of the city. The place was rather isolated. The nearest house to mine was really far away, and everyone in the community seemed to keep to themselves. One evening at around 6 p.m., I was sitting by my front window. There came a knock at my door, but I wasn't expecting anyone. Peering through the glass, I saw a man, a stranger, standing on my porch. I opened the door, not wanting to be unfriendly. The man claimed to be my neighbor. That was a surprise, since I thought I was the only one for miles around. We spoke for a few minutes. The guy had a really good personality, and we were hitting it off. At one point, he finally asked if he could come in. I almost said yes, but stopped myself at the last second. The guy had a strange urgency in his voice, and it put me off a little. I told him I was tired, and said maybe we could do it another time. He frowned, but he nodded and turned away. I watched him walk back down the path, then he turned out of my sight. Once he was gone, I felt strange about the whole thing. It wasn't every day that somebody showed up unannounced in these parts. I locked the door, double-checked it, and drew the curtains. The night grew darker, and I tried to forget the man. I really wasn't sure what a neighbor was around there anyway. Maybe 10 miles away was considered a neighbor. As days passed, I forgot about the man. It had been about 2 weeks, and I hadn't seen him again. I did meet some of the other people in the area, but none of them looked anything like that guy. My nearest neighbor was a young family, and there was another single guy as well. I asked them both about the guy who came to my door, and neither had seen anyone who matched the description. After another week, I had still not seen him, but then one night something happened. I heard it from my bed upstairs. There was a faint scraping sound against my front door. I froze, and my heart started pounding really hard. There was again, a persistent and deliberate rattle. I didn't know what it was, but I feared the worst. A burglary out there was really terrifying, because it was far away from the police station. Panic seized me, and I tiptoed to the window, peering out into the darkness. It was hard to see anything. All I could see was trees and the looming shadows of the countryside. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of the intruder. The scraping grew louder, but I couldn't see anything from my bedroom window, especially in the dark. Whoever it was, they were determined. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone. My first instinct was to call for help, but the signal was weak out there, and I couldn't make a call to any of my friends. I called 911 instead. When I spoke to the operator, he told me it would be at least 30 minutes. I whispered that it was an emergency, but that didn't change anything. I clenched my teeth, trying to think of another plan. I decided to creep to the back of my house, and I kept my steps as silent as I could. There, hidden in the corner, was a small toolbox, and I pulled out a heavy wrench. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Heart pounding, I approached the back door, my breath coming fast and shallow. The scraping had turned into a series of sharp thuds. They echoed through the silent house like thunder on a still night. I was shaking almost uncontrollably at this point, but I managed to get out to the back of my house. Summoning all my courage, I walked around my house and peeked out to the front porch. It was really dark, so I was not worried about being seen. One of my faint porch lights was on though, so I could see the intruder. I stood there trembling, the wrench heavy in my hand. I scanned the area around my house, but there was no sign of any car or truck, just that single man trying to pry his way into my front door. I looked on helplessly, but I took some comfort in knowing that if he got in, I wouldn't be there. From that dark corner on the outside of my house, I watched as he finally broke my door down and disappeared into my house. It felt like hours since I'd called the cops, but when I looked at my phone, it had only been 20 minutes. I stayed out there in the darkness for several minutes, and eventually the cops showed up. They went into my house and brought the man out in handcuffs. His face was pointed down, and I couldn't tell what he looked like. He was placed into a police car and taken away. I talked to one of the cops after that. He asked me some questions that I wasn't expecting. They wanted to know if I had any stalkers that I knew about. Until then, I was under the impression that it was just a robbery. The officer then told me that the intruder was found in my bed, naked. There was no part of me that thought I was being stalked, or anything of the sort. Then I remembered the guy who came to my door weeks earlier. I told the officer about that, but also mentioned that I wasn't sure if it was him or not. To be honest, I might not even recognize the guy if I saw him, so I couldn't even pick him out of a lineup. I never found out if the two incidents were connected, but the guy was caught, and I never had another strange visitor come to my door, so take that for what you will. I'm happy enough that he's gone. I'm from a small town in Saskatchewan. It's near several reserves and is rife with crime, drugs, poverty, gang violence, and desperation. Anyone who knows the province even a little bit will know exactly what I mean. I've spent 21 of my 26 years there, the rest in Nova Scotia and Dawson Creek, BC. I've always had horrific things happening to and around me, but they never registered as the disturbing kind of stuff. I'm a storyteller by nature, and always just added them to my ever-expanding box of humorous anecdotes to tell at parties and social gatherings. As of late, people have suggested that I start sharing them, because one of them is apparently enough to give someone PTSD. People are amazed that I'm of sound mind and still able to function after all the crap I've seen. As a teenager, I was the type of kid most of us become, the middle-class white kid who spends his nights smoking dope and walking around making sarcastic comments about his surroundings with good friends. At the time, I was hanging out with this kid who I'll rename Gene for the sake of anonymity. This specific night, we'd gotten sick of playing Gears of War 2 and wanted to go for a walk. I was never a Gears of War guy. To me, violence is boring. I was raised on Nintendo, and at the time, I was a casual Sims player who spent most of his time writing short stories. Gene had spent the 12 hours before I came over playing Gears of War, so easy to say, by 11 p.m., we were both fed up. We had decided to check out which new games had been released at the store, which was about 2 kilometers from his house. That's 2 kilometers through the thicket of the town. Through the drug dealers' houses, homeless camps, and abandoned warehouses. Also through the areas where the goths, white supremacists, and emo kids would hang out, right into Desperation Avenue. It was that neighborhood where nobody lives unless they absolutely have to. We got to the GameStop about half an hour before closing and began browsing. It was so dark outside that looking through the store windows made it seem like we were in an oil pit, just thick, viscous blackness. I felt understandably uneasy from the start, and right before closing, my friend decided on some off-brand James Bond game for the original Xbox. I was glad to get out of there. When we left the store, we got into the light at the back side of the building. At that time, that was the last light that we'd see until we crossed over to the safer part of town. All of a sudden, we heard a native man sweetly talking to someone. We turned to our right to see a tall, muscular man with 2 slightly overweight henchmen standing at the front door to an apartment. His Glock was pressing down on the Speakerbox button. A woman could be heard on the speaker saying stuff like, "No, I ain't letting you in, babe. You probably got your goons outside." The man still had his gun pressing the button. His backups were hiding revolvers behind their backs. Then he said,
Come on, who do you think I am? I wouldn't be here if I didn't want to make it right.
His voice was both completely condescending and disgustingly playful. Disgustingly playful, like when you have a couple nearby doing baby talk to one another and you pray for someone to drug and drag you away. Then the woman started talking. She carried on, and as she did, the guy turned back to see us watching this unfold. Then he whistled. One of his goons saw us, and we darted through the park, past the public school, into Drug Dealer Alley, and across to the better side of town. When I hit the Catholic school, I was so relieved. I stopped to take a breath, laughing at what I just survived. Jean and I were separated at that point. Then while resting my hands on my knees, I tried to catch my breath. And I looked around trying to see if anybody might be lurking. I then proceeded through the alley and climbed the fence, falling into the backyard of Jean's mom's house. I then snuck in the back door. A few minutes later, as I creepily checked the house for Jean, something fell onto the back doorstep. I opened the curtains to see Jean, out of breath, laughing, and unscathed. I opened up and said, "Wow, that was a rush." Then he led me up to his room, where we watched some Afro Samurai for the rest of the night. I never found out what happened in this case, because how's a grade 12 student going to? I will say though, that a long time later, the entire block was under lockdown to track a scent that the police thought was a gas leak. However, it wound up being some poor woman who liquidized into her carpet. It was the middle of summer, and all they had left was a couple of skull bones and a giant puddle in the carpet of that same building. No one knows how long she had been there. I'm not saying the two incidents were related, but it is odd. After that, they issued 6 private security details watching the area at all times. Now I think we're down to 1.